Your phone's camera says 48 megapixels and you paid for every one of them. And your phone doesn't use them. It reads all 48, adds them up in 4s and hands you 12. And Apple says so out loud, keeping photo size at a practical 12 megapixels. So the company that printed that number on the box throws 3/4 of it away on every photo you take, and it's right too. But that number was never counting what you think it counts. And it isn't an Apple thing. Walk over to Android and it's the same story in the same words. Samsung builds a 50 megapixel sensor with pixels 1.2 microns across, and then adds 4 of those pixels together into one, which makes the pixel 2.4 microns across, and in Samsung's own words, quadruples the light sensitivity. And the photo it saves is 12.5 megapixels. So both companies build a sensor at one resolution, hand you a picture at 1/4 of it, and it scales past 4. Samsung's 200 megapixel sensor puts 16 neighboring pixels together into one, and the photo it saves is 12.5 megapixels again. So the biggest number anybody has ever printed on a phone box drops to 12.5, and both companies wrote that down in public. So why would anybody build a camera that adds its own pixels back together? So start with the thing that number actually counts. A pixel on that sensor isn't a dot in the picture yet. It's a tiny well cut into silicon, and its only job is to sit there while the shutter's open and collect whatever light falls on it. And light falls in pieces. It arrives as photons one at a time, and you can count them, and the well is doing exactly that. When the shutter shuts, the phone asks every well how many it caught, and that count becomes the brightness of one dot in your photo. So a photo is a grid of counts. And now the part that decides everything else. That sheet of silicon is a fixed size, a few millimeters across, and it isn't getting any bigger. So a 48 megapixel sensor catches no more light than a 12 megapixel one the same size. It's rain falling on a tray, and cutting the tray into more compartments has never once made it rain harder. So each well gets 1/4 of what it used to. And 1/4 of the light costs you much more than 1/4 of the picture. Because counting light is like counting anything that turns up at random. The photons don't queue and arrive on schedule. They land where they land, so 2 identical wells side by side, both pointed at the same gray wall, catch slightly different numbers, and that difference is the grain you see in a dark photo. It isn't your phone being sloppy. It's the light itself arriving unevenly, and it happens on every camera ever built. But that wobble doesn't shrink as fast as the count grows. Catch 100 photons and you're off by around 10. Catch 10,000 and you're off by around 100, which is a far smaller slice of the total. I'm rounding, and the rule underneath is exact. The error goes as the square root of the count. So cut one well into 4, and each of the 4 catches 1/4 of the light, and each one comes back with half the quality, not 1/4. Square root of 4 is 2. So the phone's answer is the obvious one. It takes the 4 small wells, adds their counts together, and calls the total 1 pixel. And adding those 4 counts together gets back everything you just lost. 4 wells that caught 1/4 each, added up, hold exactly as many photons as one big well would have caught on its own. Same total, same wobble, same square root. Pour 4 buckets of rain into 1 bucket, and you've got the water that fell on the whole patio, and it makes no difference how many buckets you used to catch it. So the megapixels are free. Cut the sensor as finely as you like. Add the pieces back together at the end, and you land in exactly the same place you started. Which leaves one thing standing, and I think it's the only part of all this that anybody actually notices. Switch your camera to the full 48 and take that photo in a dark room. And it really does come out worse. Because the photons are only half of what a well costs you. Every well has to be asked. And every time your phone asks one, the answer comes back with a small error of its own laid on top, from the electronics doing the asking. Ask one big well once, and you pay that error once. Ask 4 small wells, and you pay it 4 times over. Then there's the fencing. Every well is walled off from its neighbors so the light can't leak sideways. And those walls take up room on the silicon. 4 small wells carry twice the fencing of one big one, so more of that sheet ends up as wall and less of it as well. And a small well fills up sooner. Once it's full, it can't count any higher, so the brightest parts of the scene stop being bright and just go flat white. The light splits evenly between the 4 wells. The asking, the fencing, and the filling don't split at all. You pay every one of them 4 times over. And above all of that sits the lens, which has a hard limit of its own. Point a perfect lens at one distant speck of light, and it won't hand you back a speck. Light bends around the edge of the opening, so what lands on the sensor is a small disc. 2 things set how wide that disc comes out: the color of the light and how wide the opening is. So run it for green light through the main camera on a recent iPhone Pro at f1.78, and the disc comes out 2.4 microns across. Now put that next to the pixels underneath it. Each one of those 48 million pixels is 1.22 microns wide. So the blur the lens is handing over is already 2 pixels across, and it's almost exactly the size of one combined pixel. You're slicing up something that arrived blurred, and yet your phone keeps all 48 million of them, and it does use them, just never when you'd expect. Because in bright sun, there's light to spare. Every well fills right up, the wobble is tiny next to the count, and now the fine slicing buys you detail that's actually there. So Samsung puts it plainly. If enough light is available, the sensor switches to a higher resolution, and Apple hands you the switch. On a recent iPhone, the camera sits at 24 megapixels by default, and you can move it between 12, 24, and 48. And that 24 isn't the raw sensor either. Your phone builds it out of the combined 12 and the full 48 fused together. So the number on the box was never a lie, and it was never a promise. It's a mode, and it's the one your phone reaches for last, because megapixels only ever counted how finely your camera slices the light. The sensor underneath decides how much light shows up to be sliced in the first place, and nobody prints that number on the box.
Everything you just figured out rests on something deeper, and that's the next video, so start there. Would you rather understand your computer than just use it? Then subscribe, and I'll see you next time, further down the stack.